Hello, and welcome to the Mcgs Podcast. I'm Ryan.
I'm Jess.
I'm Julia.
And I'm Tamara.
In this podcast, we will be interviewing two gender non-conforming friends of ours.
We want people to be aware of the gender spectrum and dismiss the theory of binary gender.
First, everyone needs to be able to determine the difference between sex and gender. Sex is biological. It's what makes up our genitalia and chromosomes. Gender is a socially constructed characteristics we label people with based on their sex.
For example, if your sex is female, expectations for you to be feminine and have traits like being nurturing is often put on you by society.
And if you're born a male, people expect you to be strong physically and emotionally.
Not only do biologically male and female people not fit into this gender binary, people who are born intersex can't fit into the binary at all.
Transgender people are also a huge part of the gender nonconforming community. A transgender person's gender does not match with their biological sex.
So why is it an issue? Well, this community of people have been there for decades but still struggle with their basic lifestyle.
Our society and government has turned a blind eye to transgender, intersex, and gender nonconforming people for too long.
The term two-spirit is used by Native American communities for gender nonconforming individuals in their community and has been around for hundreds of years.
In a 2015 U.S. trans survey by the National Center for Transgender Equality, 30% of transgender people face discrimination in the workplace because of their gender identity, and 40% reported attempting suicide in their lifetime, which is 9 times the overall rate in the U.S.
Gender nonconforming and transgender people have faced years of discrimination and still have fights ahead of them.
The New York Times states, the Trump administration is considering narrowly defining gender as a biological, immutable condition determined by genitalia at birth. The most drastic move yet in a government-wide effort to roll back recognition and protections of transgender people under federal civil rights law.
I interviewed a close friend of mine. She's a non-binary student at UC Santa Cruz. This is Kyla.
So I identify as gender non-binary or gender non-conforming.
So what pronouns do you identify with?
I use either she, her, hers pronouns or they, them pronouns.
Do people often get your pronouns wrong?
Most times. In college, it's kind of different, just the college that I'm going to. They usually ask before any sort of introduction or meeting. But most of the time when I'm out in public, people refer to me as Miss or Ma'am.
When they do misgender you, does it bother you?
I've gotten kind of used to it. I don't really blame people for seeing the world as only sticking to gender binaries, traditional gender binaries. But in a perfect world, I would prefer if people didn't assume that everybody was either male or female, depending on what they look like.
And can you tell us a little bit about what is the gender spectrum and where do you fall on it?
So basically, just like sexuality, gender identity is a spectrum. So there are people who identify as cis female, cis male, trans female, trans male, and then there are people who don't really fall into any of those categories, and that's usually referred to as usually gender non-binary, outside of the binary, or gender non-conforming. I generally usually fall somewhere in the middle. There are days that I wake up and I feel a lot more feminine. And that's not just, I feel like I want to wear a dress today, or I feel like I want to wear basketball shorts or whatever today. I feel like today I'm meant to be a woman, and then some days I will wake up and think today I'm meant to be, I was born in the wrong body, sort of thing, on specific days. So I would say probably 60% of the time, I feel comfortable being labeled as female, and about 40% of the time, I feel uncomfortable in my body. And that's why I usually say that I usually prefer like not being gendered at all, almost, because I just don't feel like I fit the traditional view of what gender means to the majority of society.
Do you think the media portrays your gender, or is it mostly binary?
Most of the time it's binary. There's not a lot of representation for non-binary people, which is interesting because non-binary genders have existed in many cultures from like the beginning of civilization, namely cultures, Native American cultures and Polynesian cultures, but it's largely left out of history and out of the media. So it's not very well represented, and when it is, it's usually as, oh, they're the odd liberal kid, or it's just a phase, sort of thing, or just this person likes to dress androgynous. But there's not a lot of talk about people who actually fall outside of the gender binary.
Does your school recognize your gender on official documents?
My school is pretty unique, pretty liberal in that aspect. They do recognize gender non-binary as a gender and other genders, such as agender, gender fluidity, as official genders on documents. But I know that's pretty rare when it comes to official documentation. I know California, in legal documents with driver's licenses and that sort of thing, gender non-binary is now an official gender in the eyes of the law. But a lot of times when it comes to the school and applying for things, applying for scholarships, most schools don't recognize it as a gender. It's usually male or female. But my school does recognize non-binary as being a gender.
And do you think your sexual identity correlates with your gender?
So sexuality and gender are two separate things. A lot of people tend to put them in the same category. But I just so happen to be bisexual or pansexual, whatever term people want to use. So I'm attracted to all genders, but there are lots of non-binary people who are only attracted to male, female, or somewhere in the middle. It doesn't have to affect sexuality at all.
I interviewed a friend of mine as well, Cal. Cal is a non-binary student and activist. Okay, so first question is, where do you fall on the gender spectrum?
I identify sort of on the basic level as a non-binary trans person. Is sort of the biggest, broadest umbrella term that I can use. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of it all, I identify as genderqueer and gender fluid. So to unpack all those words that I used, being transgender to me means I don't identify with the sex I was assigned at birth. So I was assigned female at birth, and I realized about when I was I would say starting to realize about when I was 14 that like a lot of this stuff that happened to me in my past, the way that I dressed, I identified at that time as a lesbian, but that didn't really quite seem to fit with all of my experiences. And when I heard about transness through one of the organizations I was part of, and I met other trans people, I was hanging out with these folks for about a year, and I was like, oh, I'm going to try using different pronouns, and I'm going to try this. And I realized that, like, oh my gosh, transness explains so much of my identity and what I've been feeling about myself since I was very little, and this is like a much better explanation and word to use for my identity. I use non-binary because I don't identify as a man or a woman, like, exclusively. I identify sort of somewhere in the middle. Genderqueer is sort of another way of saying that, with some more historical background of being used, I believe, since the 80s to describe people who are non-binary. Don't quote me on that. And gender fluid I use to describe myself because for me, my gender presentation is fluid. Sometimes I'll dress more masculinely. Sometimes I'll wear a dress or dress more femininely, and my experience of my own gender sort of fluctuates depending on the day.
Awesome.
In conclusion, it's a common misconception that gender and sex are the same, when in fact, they have completely different meanings.
Gender is socially constructed, which means its definition changes over time and in different societies.
Currently in the U.S., gender consists of characteristics we assign to people based on their sex.
What most of our society fails to acknowledge is that a lot of people do not fit into these strict rules. Hopefully, after listening to our podcast, people will have a better understanding of gender and all of the misconceptions from the point of view of transgenders.
Thank you.